It's early. The light is still gray at the edges of your yard, and the grass is wet in that way. It only is before anyone else is awake. You filled the bird bath last night almost without thinking about it, the way you fill a kettle. And now there's a robin standing at the rim, not drinking yet, just standing, head tilted, perfectly still. You've seen this 100 times, robins at water. It's one of the most ordinary images in the entire natural world, printed on garden signs, painted on teacups, background noise in 10,000 nature documentaries. Nothing about it should feel strange. And yet, there's a reason humans have watched this exact bird at this exact kind of moment for longer than almost any other species on the continent. Not because it's rare, because it isn't. Because for nearly a century, when something in the environment quietly went wrong, the robin was very often the first living thing to show it. Not through mystery, through biology, through blood and eggs and silence where there used to be song. What that robin standing at your bird bath is actually doing has very little to do with you. But what it represents, historically, scientifically, is one of the strangest and most overlooked stories in modern ecology. Most people assume a bird at a bird bath is a simple transaction. Thirsty animal, available water, end of story. That assumption isn't wrong exactly. It's just incomplete in a way most people never think to question. Because robins are unusually easy to watch. They forage in the open, on lawns, in daylight, which almost no other songbird does with such comfort around humans. They eat enormous quantities of earthworms, sometimes over a dozen a day for an adult feeding a nest of young, and earthworms happen to be one of the most efficient biological sponges in any garden ecosystem, absorbing whatever has soaked into the soil above them. Put those two facts together, and you get something researchers noticed almost by accident decades ago. A bird that eats constantly from the ground, forages where humans can see it, and reacts, sometimes visibly, sometimes fatally, to whatever that ground has absorbed. Most people don't realize that robins were never just charming lawn ornaments to ecologists. They were early instruments. Imperfect, unpaid, unwitting instruments. But instruments all the same. Here's what most backyard bird lovers never get told. In the middle of the 20th century, something started happening across American suburbs that seemed, at first, almost too small to matter. Robin populations in certain towns began collapsing after routine pesticide spraying, not from any direct poisoning of the birds themselves, but through a longer, quieter chain. The pesticides settled into soil and leaf litter. Earthworms absorbed it slowly, concentrating it in their tissue over months. Robins, eating dozens of worms a day, accumulated it faster than their bodies could clear it out. The birds didn't just die in some towns. In others, they simply stopped singing in spring, stopped nesting successfully, stopped being there at all, and almost nobody connected it to anything until someone finally wrote it all down. That someone was a biologist named Rachel Carson, and the emptiness she described, an American spring with no robins left to sing in it, became one of the most consequential opening images in the history of environmental writing. It's the reason an entire generation of scientists started looking at ordinary backyard birds not as background scenery, but as evidence. That's the emotional core of what we're circling here. This isn't really a story about a bird. It's a story about how long it can take a society to notice that something is wrong, and how, again and again, it was a small, common, unremarkable animal standing quietly at the edge of human attention that noticed first. Which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a second. If a robin's presence or its sudden absence has historically tracked things going wrong at a chemical, invisible level in a landscape, what does it mean that most of us now watch that same bird purely as decoration? What are we not seeing anymore simply because we stopped expecting to see anything at all? Before we go further into exactly how scientists learned to read this and what modern robins are still quietly revealing about the ground beneath your own yard right now, it's worth pausing on one thing. None of what follows requires you to believe anything mystical about birds. It requires the opposite. It requires taking an ordinary animal seriously enough to actually watch it. If that kind of quiet, evidence-based curiosity is something you enjoy, this channel exists entirely for moments like this one, so it's worth sticking around because the next part of this story goes somewhere most people never expect. Section 1. Long before anyone used the phrase bioindicator species, miners in Britain carried caged canaries down into coal shafts. because canaries are more sensitive to carbon monoxide and methane than humans are, and a canary that stopped singing or collapsed on its perch was giving miners a window of minutes, sometimes only seconds, to get out before the same gas reached them. The bird wasn't trying to save anyone. It was simply more biologically fragile to an invisible threat than the humans standing next to it, and its collapse became, by pure coincidence of physiology, a warning system. Robins became something similar, but slower and stranger, because the threat they revealed wasn't a single dramatic gas leak. It was chronic. It built up over seasons in soil, in worms, in the eggs robins laid the following spring. Researchers studying the DDT era found something specifically chilling in robin eggshells collected from affected areas. The shells were measurably thinner than eggs collected decades earlier, fragile enough to crack under the ordinary weight of an incubating parent. That single physical detail, a shell too thin to survive being sat on, became one of the most cited pieces of evidence in the case against a chemical that had, until then, been marketed as essentially harmless. Picture that scene for a second. A robin returning to her nest after searching a chemically treated lawn for worms all morning, settling in to incubate. And the very act of sitting, the most basic instinctual behavior a mother bird performs, becoming the thing that ends the clutch. There's no drama in that image, no violence, just quiet biological cause and effect, which is exactly why it took so long for anyone to notice the pattern at all. Nothing about a cracked egg looks like an alarm bell. It just looks like nature having a bad year. Section 2. What made robins useful to scientists wasn't intelligence or awareness. It was position. Robins sit at an unusually exposed point in a suburban food web, low enough to eat directly from soil and leaf litter, common enough to exist in nearly every yard on a street, and visible enough that ordinary residents, not just researchers, could notice when something changed. That combination is rare. Most animals sensitive to environmental contamination live somewhere humans rarely look, underground, in wetlands, deep in forest canopy. Robins live on the lawn, in full view, foraging within arm's reach of the people whose choices were actually altering the chemistry of that lawn in the first place. That's the quiet irony underneath this entire story. The bird best positioned to reveal the consequences of a pesticide decision was standing directly in the yard of the person who made that decision, hopping across the grass in broad daylight, completely unaware that its own body was quietly cataloging what had been sprayed there. Modern researchers still use exactly this logic, just with more precise tools. Wildlife toxicologists studying suburban and urban contamination frequently sample songbirds, including robins, for heavy metals, residual pesticides, and other pollutants, because a bird's blood and feather tissue can reveal a chemical history of a specific patch of ground far more directly than soil testing alone, which only tells you what's present, not what's actually being absorbed into a living system. A robin, in that sense, isn't sending you a message. It's already a completed lab result, walking across your lawn if anyone bothers to actually look. Section 3. There's a second, quieter signal. Robins reveal one that has nothing to do with chemicals and everything to do with timing. American robins have long been treated informally as a seasonal signal, the bird whose return supposedly marks the true start of spring. But long-term citizen science tracking, through programs like eBird and decades of Christmas bird count data, has shown that robin migration timing in many regions has been shifting earlier over recent decades, arriving and departing on a calendar that increasingly doesn't match the one written in older field guides. That shift isn't robins making a decision, it's robins responding, the way nearly every migratory species eventually responds, to changes in temperature and food availability tied to a broader warming pattern across the regions they depend on. A bird arriving 11 days earlier than it did 2 generations ago isn't choosing to adapt. Its internal cues, tied to daylight and temperature thresholds refined over tens of thousands of years, are simply firing at a different point on the calendar now, because the world outside its body has quietly moved the goalposts, which means every robin standing at a birdbath in what feels like an unusually early spring is, in its own small way, standing at the edge of a dataset, not warning you, just existing on a schedule that's been rewritten by forces far larger than any single yard, any single bird, any single choice you made about when to fill that basin with water. Section 4. Here's where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because it isn't only about the past. Robins remain part of active wildlife disease surveillance today, alongside crows, jays, and other common backyard birds, in networks tracking mosquito-borne illnesses like West Nile virus across North America. When public health researchers began building bird death surveillance systems in the early 2000s, following a serious outbreak that first surfaced through unusual crow deaths in New York, common, visible backyard species were exactly what made the system work at all. You cannot build a disease surveillance network around a bird nobody sees. You build it around the ones sitting in plain view of millions of ordinary yards, because those are the sightings that actually get reported. That's the pattern running through this entire story. Across 70 years, across pesticides, across shifting seasons, across viral outbreaks. Robins were never chosen for this role because they were special. They were chosen because they were common enough, visible enough, and biologically exposed enough to accidentally become witnesses to things happening at a scale far larger than themselves. Section 5. So return to that image from the very beginning. A robin at your bird bath at dawn, head tilted, not yet drinking. It is not thinking about pesticides or migration schedules or viral surveillance networks. It has no concept of any of that. It is a bird, checking a patch of open water for safety before it commits to being vulnerable at the edge of it, exactly as its ancestors have done for longer than any human institution has existed, and that's precisely what makes this story so strange to sit with. The robin isn't trying to tell you anything. It never was. What it actually represents is something quieter and, in a way, more unsettling, an accidental record, a body that absorbs, reflects, and occasionally collapses under whatever a landscape has been doing to itself, long before most humans notice anything has changed at all. We are edging now toward the part of this story that reframes everything you just watched, because there's a difference between a warning and a witness, and almost nobody stops to ask which one they've actually been looking at their entire life. Consider for a moment what it would take for you to personally detect a slow accumulation of pesticide residue in your own soil. Lab equipment, sample collection, weeks of waiting for results. Now consider what a robin does, entirely by accident, simply by needing to eat dozens of worms a day to survive. It has been performing that same test, unpaid, unaware, for its entire existence as a species, in every yard, on every street, across an entire continent, for longer than modern toxicology has existed as a science. That is the real story, hiding underneath a bird standing at a bird bath. Not an alert, not a message meant for you specifically. Something closer to an involuntary confession, written in blood chemistry and eggshell thickness and migration timing, by an animal that has no idea it's confessing anything at all. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If robins have been revealing environmental truths this clearly, for this long purely by accident, the only reason any of it ever mattered is that somebody, somewhere, eventually bothered to actually look closely enough to notice the pattern. Rachel Carson didn't discover a secret robins were hiding. She discovered a silence humans had simply stopped paying attention to until it became too loud to ignore. Which means the real question was never what the robin at your bird bath is trying to tell you, is whether you're the kind of person who would even notice if it stopped showing up. So look again at that same dawn scene, the wet grass, the gray light, the robin at the rim of the water, head tilted, still. Nothing about that image has changed. What's changed is what you now know sits underneath it. 70 years of quiet chemistry, shifting calendars, and disease surveillance networks, all resting on the back of an animal that never once intended to carry any of it. The robin was never speaking to you. It was simply the last honest thing left standing in a system that stopped listening a long time ago. So here's the only question worth asking. When was the last time you actually noticed whether the robins in your own yard were still coming back, still singing, still exactly on schedule, or whether, without you ever realizing it, something had already gone quiet?